finding much of what was introduced by the House was unverified second or third-hand reporting cribbed from a biased news media, including stories based on anonymous sources whose identities aren't even known to them, never mind my client. They manufactured and doctored evidence, so much so that they had to withdraw it. We had the evidence after we started the trial. They went on for 2 days. So in the evening, I was able to go back and take a really close look at the stuff. Myself and Mr. Castor and Ms. Bateman and Mr. Brennan. So we all worked hard and looked at the evidence. There's 4 volumes of books, little tiny print. And we started with literally had 12, 14 hours to really look at the evidence before we had to go on. And just in that short time of looking at the evidence, we saw them fabricating Twitter accounts. We saw the masked man sitting at his desk with the New York Times there. And when we looked closely, we found that the date was wrong, the check had been added. They fabricated evidence. They made it up. They never addressed that in their closing. As though it were acceptable. As though it were all right. As though that's the way it should be done here in the Senate of the United States of America. Fraud. Flat out. Fraud. Where I come from and the courts that I practice in, there's very harsh repercussions for what they pulled in this trial. As we've shown, the House managers were caught creating false representations of tweets. Manipulating videos and introducing into the record completely discredited lies, such as the Find People hoax as factual evidence. Most of what the House managers said and shown you would be inadmissible in any respectable court of law. They were not trying a case, they were telling a political tale, a fable, and a patently false one at that. House Democrats have denied due process and rushed the impeachment because they know that a fair trial would reveal Mr. Trump's innocence of the charges against him. The more actual evidence that comes out, the clearer it is that this was a pre-planned and premeditated attack, which his language in no way incited. Because their case is so weak, the House managers have taken a kitchen sink approach to the supposedly single article of impeachment. They allege that Mr. Trump incited the January 6th violence. They allege that he abused power by attempting to pressure Georgia's Secretary of State Raffensperger to undermine the results of the 2020 election. And they allege that he gravely and endangered the democratic system by interfering with the peaceful transition of power. At least 3 things there. Under the Senate rules, each of these allegations must have been alleged in a separate article of impeachment. I need not remind this chamber that Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials provides, in pertinent part, that an article of impeachment shall not be divisible thereon. Why is that? Because the article at issue here alleges multiple wrongs in the single article. It would be impossible to know if 2/3 of the members agreed on the entire article, or just on parts of it. as the basis for.
So right now, we are watching the impeachment trial on one network. I think the plan is to show what's going on other networks. So I'm slowly trying to get this queued up as we go.
In short, this impeachment has been a complete charade from beginning to end. The entire spectacle has been nothing but the unhinged pursuit of a long-standing political vendetta against Mr. Trump by the opposition party. As we have shown, Democrats were obsessed with impeaching Mr. Trump from the very beginning of his term. The House Democrats tried to impeach him in his first year. They tried to impeach him in his second year. They didn't impeach him in his third year. And they impeached him again in his fourth year. And now they have conducted a phony impeachment show trial when he's a private citizen out of office. This hastily orchestrated and unconstitutional circus is the House Democrats' final desperate attempt to accomplish their obsessive desire of the last 5 years. Since the moment he stepped into the political arena, since my client stepped in, they have been possessed by an overwhelming zeal to vanquish an independent-minded outsider from the midst of shame, demean, silence, and demonize his supporters. In the desperate hope that they will never, ever pose an electoral challenge, we heard one of the congressmen on the screen. If you don't impeach him, he might be elected again. That's the fear. That's what's driving this impeachment. When you deliberate over your decision, there are 4 distinct grounds under which you must acquit a client. First is jurisdiction. There is no jurisdiction. And if you believe that, you still get to say it. 2, Rule 23. It had to be divisible. Each allegation had to be singularly set out in front of you so it could be voted on and to see if 2/3 of you think that they proved that case or not. They didn't do that. You gotta ask yourself why. They know the Senate rules. They got it, and so did I. Why did they do it? Because they had to be investigated first of all. But also, what they found out is they were preparing all of this, but they couldn't do it. So they threw as much in as they could and made as many bold allegations as they could. And maybe 2/3 of you would fall for it. That's why the rules don't allow it to go that way. Due process, I've exhausted that subject. It's a really good reason for all of you in this chamber, to stop the politics, to read the Constitution and apply it to this proceeding, and acknowledge that the lack of due process way over shocking, and you must not stand for it. And of course, the First Amendment, the actual facts of this case. There were no words of incitement. 4 grounds. Nobody gets to tell you which ground to pick, and nobody gets to tell you how many grounds to consider. Senators, do not let House Democrats take this manifold crusade any further. The Senate does not have to go down this dark path of anonymity and division. You do not have to.
We are now officially going to be minutes away from all civil decisions I've ever seen in American history. The Donald J. Trump now will
Unconstitutional
arrest land or those symbols.
It is time to allow our nation to move forward. It is time to address the real business pressing this nation. The pandemic, our economy, racial inequality, economic and social inequality. These are the things that we need to be thinking and working on for all of us in America. All of us. With your vote, you can defend the Constitution, you can protect due process, and you can allow America's healing to begin. I urge the Senate to acquit and vindicate
Here is the
the
close.
Constitution of this great republic. Thank you.
So that is the Trump Defense Council now closing his statement. There's Jamie Rassin.
I understand I'm told we have around 27 minutes, but I will return all of that, but perhaps 5 back to you. There's just a few things that I need to.
So I'm going to do one more comment here. Jamie Raskin.
So an extraordinary and perhaps unprecedented act of self-restraint on my part. I will resist the opportunity to bring back every single false and illogical thing that you just heard, and I'm going to be able to return to you in perhaps 22 to 23 minutes. A few points. We've definitely made some progress in the last few days, because a few days ago, the president's team, although I think it was perhaps a member who has since left the team, lectured us that this was not an insurrection, and said that impeachment managers were outrageous in using the word insurrection. Today, counsel in his closing statement said it was a violent insurrection, and he denounced it. And I would certainly love to see President Trump also call it a violent insurrection and denounce it too. And I believe, although I don't have a verbatim text, that counsel called for long sentences for the people who were involved. Again, I would love to hear that come from the president as well. The distinguished counsel complains that there's no precedent with the developed body of law that the Senate has for impeaching and convicting a president who incites violent insurrection against the Congress and the government of the United States. Well, I suppose that's true, because it never occurred to any other president of the United States, from George Washington to John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison to James Monroe to Abraham Lincoln to Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush to Barack Obama to incite a violent insurrection against the Union. You're right, we've got no precedent for that. And so they think that somehow is a mark in their favor. That's a score for them. That this Senate has to be the first one to define incitement of violent insurrection against the Union. And so the gentleman puts it on me. He says, inciting the president for committing incitement to violent insurrection against the Union is the new Raskin doctrine. We've tried to convince him that there are well-known principles and elements of incitement which we have talked to you about ad nauseum, and that this is an intrinsically, inherently fact-based judgment. But if that is the Raskin doctrine, that a president of the United States cannot incite violent insurrection against the Union and the Congress, then I embrace it, and I take it as an honor. Most law professors never even get a doctrine named after them. So I will accept that. And finally, the counsel goes back to Julian Bond's case, because I think in the final analysis, their best argument, as pathetically weak as it is really about the First Amendment. But remember, they keep talking about stifling President Trump's speech. Someone tell me when his speech has ever been stifled. He says exactly what he wants, whenever he wants. Even when you convict him for incitement of insurrection, he will continue to say whatever he wants on that day. Remember, They referred yesterday to interference with his liberty, which I found absolutely bizarre, because everybody knows that he will not spend 1 minute in prison or jail from conviction on these charges. It is a civil remedy to protect all of us, to protect the entire country, our children, our Constitution, our future. That's what impeachment, trial, conviction are all about. Julian Bond. See, I knew Julian Bond, so forgive me. Most people say, don't even respond. I said, I gotta respond to this, okay? Julian Bond was a civil rights activist who decided to go into politics, like the people in this room, like all of us who are in politics. And they tried to keep him out. He was a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really launched the voting rights movement in America. It's a great story that Bob Moses tells in his book called Radical Equations about, he was a graduate student in mathematics at Harvard, and he went down to Mississippi. You know why? It's this picture in the New York Times of black civil rights protesters, college students, I think in North Carolina, AT&T. He saw a picture of them on the front of the New York Times, and they were sitting in at a lunch counter, and he looked at the picture and he said, they looked the way that I felt. They looked the way I felt, and he said he had to go down south to Mississippi. And they launched the voting rights movement. That's where the phrase one person, one vote comes from. It was not invented by the Supreme Court. They would go door to door to try to register people to vote. But anyway, Julian Bond was part of that movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, nonviolence. It was the end and it was the means, nonviolence. And he ran for the state legislature in Georgia. A pack of other civil rights activists followed, like our great, late, beloved colleague John Lewis, who's in our hearts today. And when he got elected, they wanted to try to keep him from being sworn into the Georgia legislature. And so they said, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is taking a position against the Vietnam War. You're a member of SNCC. We're not going to admit you because you took a position against the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said you cannot prevent someone from swearing an oath to become a member of a legislative body because of a position that they took or a group they were part of took before they got sworn in. That's the exact opposite of Donald Trump. He got elected to office. He swore an oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He served as president.
He is just, okay, so if just explain what you just did.
When he wanted to
Junior Raskin is actually trying to defend a point of policy and a point raised by the President's Council in defense of Julian Bond. So right back to Julian Bond.
His oath of office that he took. He's not being prevented from taking his oath in the first place. The First Amendment's on our side. He tried to overturn the will of the people, the voice of the people. He lost that election by more than 7 million votes. Some people don't want to admit it. Counsel for the president could not bring themselves to admit that the election's over. In answer to the question from the distinguished gentleman from Vermont, he refused to answer that. He said it was irrelevant. Despite all of the evidence you've heard about the big lie and how that set the stage for his incitement of the insurrectionary violence against us. First Amendment is on our side. We are defending the Bill of Rights. We are defending the constitutional structure. We are defending the separation of powers. We're defending the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House against a president who acted no better than a marauder and a member of that mob by inciting those people to come here. And in many ways, he was worse. He named the date, he named the time, and he brought them here, and now he must pay the price. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the majority leader is recognized. Mr. President, the Senate is now ready to vote on the article of impeachment.
This is time, the vote is on.
That is done. We will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The vote is on.
The clerk will read the article of impeachment.
They have now called for the vote. So Article 1, they are now calling for the vote. Majority Leader is calling for the vote. So I'm going to start counting.
The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
This is literally history as we speak.
Of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits
Right now, the going in presumption.
For rebellion against the United States from holding any office under the United States. In his conduct while President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath, faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and to the best of his ability.
So they're calling for the vote now.
The Constitution of the United States and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against.
They're reading the articles now, so you're
on January 6, 2021, pursuant to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate met at the United States Capitol for a joint session of Congress to count the votes of the Electoral College. In the months preceding the joint session, President Trump repeatedly issued false statements asserting that the presidential election results were the product of widespread fraud and should not be accepted by the American people or certified by state or federal officials. Shortly before the joint session commenced, President Trump addressed a crowd at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. There he reiterated false claims that we won this election and we won it by a landslide. He also willfully made statements that in context encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Thus incited by President Trump, members of the crowd he had addressed in an attempt to, among other objectives, interfere with the joint session's solemn constitutional duty to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, unlawfully breached and vandalized the Capitol, injured and killed law enforcement personnel, menaced members of Congress, the Vice President, and congressional personnel, and engaged in other violent, deadly, destructive, and seditious acts. President Trump's conduct on January 6, 2021, followed his prior efforts to subvert and obstruct the certification of the results of the 2020 presidential election. His prior efforts included a phone call on January 2, 2021, during which President Trump urged the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough votes to overturn the Georgia presidential election results and threatened security Raffensperger if he failed to do so. In all this, President Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and its institutions of government. He threatened the integrity of the democratic system, interfered with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled a co-equal branch of government. He therefore betrayed his trust as president to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, Donald John Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he...
So we are now in the voting phase. We're not voting, we're reading the articles now.
...not to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-government and the rule of law.
Put the audio up. The expectation at this hour is that the votes count will not exceed the 67 number. This morning, Majority Leader, former Majority Leader, and Minority Leader, Republican Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell indicated that he would be voting in an email to his colleagues in the caucus. He would be voting for acquittal. No. And they will stand.
Not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article would be, Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Boozman. Mr. Boozman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Byrd. Mr. Byrd, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hogan, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King. Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan.
So right now
Mr. Lujan,
we're
guilty.
if it gets that guilty gets to 44, he's off. 10 away.
Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr.
Present.
Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr.
That's a surprise.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty.
Not a surprise.
Ms. Rosen, guilty.
Both of the senators vote guilty.
Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shipley. Mrs. Shipley, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Miss Sinema. Miss Sinema, guilty. Miss Smith. Miss Smith, guilty. Miss Stabenow. Miss Stabenow, guilty. Mr.
7 away, and Donald Trump avoids conviction.
Not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty.
So, okay, so we're at the fifth majority point. This is the first majority point.
Guilty. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
And it appears that he has avoided. So it appears at this time, Donald Trump literally just avoided conviction today.
The yeas are 57, the nays are 43. 2/3 of the senators present on having voted guilty. The Senate judges that responded, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, on one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives. And 2/3 of the senators present, not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordering that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, judgment in the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection,
Nay.
the motion is agreed to.
Sine die.
Court of impeachment stands adjourned, sine die. And could I have order, please? The presiding officer, the acting sergeant armed escort the House managers out of the Senate chamber. In order.
That is the ball game, folks.
And after all that, it is over. Brian Williams here with you along with Nicole Wallace. You're looking at the United States Senate chamber. Their lives were threatened. The chamber was looted and desecrated. Many of their desks were ransacked. And yet, at the end of this process, they have not found in sufficient numbers that Donald Trump incited that mob that showed up at the Capitol. Many of them wearing tactical gear, replacing American flags with Trump flags. Earlier today, the Democrats had a chance to introduce a new front, a new chapter, and extend this trial with depositions and the like. They chose not to press the issue. In the end, the Democrats took a pass, and in the end, as you saw, no minds were changed. The vote was 57 to 43, the block of 7 Republicans that came forward during the test vote held together. New numbers were added to their ranks. Nicole Wallace.
You know, hot takes are so dangerous and so plentiful, and I resisted all week long pushing this week and this process through a political frame. I'll continue to do that today. At the end of the day, the record will reflect irrefutable evidence that Donald Trump did what Liz Cheney said he did. That he gathered a mob, he incited a mob, he sent the mob to march on the Capitol, and when it was underway, when his own vice president's life was in danger, he incited it further. Donald Trump doesn't disagree with those facts. Donald Trump's lawyers didn't really dispute those facts. So the defense of Donald Trump was around America got to know one of the most extraordinary public servants in the country, Jim Raskin, who lost his own son. Oh, let's listen to Chuck Schumer.
It's facts were up for debate. We saw it, we heard it, we lived it. This was the first presidential impeachment trial in history in which all senators were not only judges and jurors, but witnesses to the constitutional crime.
That's the number. This is where we're at. This is the history book, folks. That's where we're at. So, what say ye tonight? Let's go down the breakdown. Let's see who voted where.
There's nothing more un-American than that. There is nothing more antithetical to our democracy. There is nothing more insulting to the generations of American patriots who gave their lives to defend our form of government. This was the most egregious violation of the presidential oath of office and a textbook example, a classic example of an impeachable offense worthy of the Constitution's most severe remedy. In response to the incontrovertible fact
I've heard these things for a while.
the Senate was subject to a
They haven't broadcasted it yet.
sometimes incomprehensible defense of the former president. Unable to dispute the case on the merits, the former president's counsel treated us to partisan vitriol, false equivalence, and outright falsehoods. We heard the roundly debunked jurisdictional argument that the Senate cannot try a former official, a position that would mean that any president could simply resign to avoid accountability for an impeachable offense. A position which in fact would render the Senate powerless to ever enforce the disqualification clause in the Constitution. Essentially, the president
So I was trying to keep track of my own.
the Constitution was unconstitutional.
So here's where we stand. This data will come populate later in the day, but this one just evident for this hour. I'm going to go ahead and look to my paper of record.
The preposterous claim that the former president's incitement to violence was protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment right to free speech protects Americans from jail, not presidents from impeachment. If the president had said during World War II that, quote, Germany should attack the United States on Long Island, we've left it undefended, I suspect Congress would have considered that an impeachable offense. Finally,
That's the number I want to take away from this today. That. So you have your Senate Republicans, the two more Republicans than I thought possible, the two Republicans that I did not think were going to vote, and I actually kept my vote log as well, so I was wrong. The Republican that surprised me today. And I can't seem to find him. So Cassidy didn't vote. So Cassidy doesn't vote. That's actually look at. So Cassidy doesn't vote. With
January 6th would not have happened but for the actions of Donald Trump. Here's what the Republican leader of the Senate said.
so
The mob that perpetrated the quote failed insurrection unquote was on January 6th was quote.
So the Republican that naturally surprised me wasn't Braun. No, it wasn't like Braun. I'm looking at my list here.
The vast majority of the Senate Republican caucus
Was
voted to acquit
Russell didn't surprise me.
signing their names
Blackburn didn't surprise me. Blumenthal didn't surprise me. One didn't surprise me.
forever.
Burr. So the first surprise on the list is Burr.
In the history of the United States of America,
Richard Burr from North Carolina.
Donald Trump will live as a
First surprise.
infamy.
The first new Republican on the list.
The United States Senate.
Cassidy doesn't vote. Susan Collins doesn't surprise me.
Republican senators lamented what might become a party of Donald Trump.
These two don't surprise me. Craven doesn't surprise me. Doesn't surprise me. Doesn't surprise me. Let me see Dan Smith real quick. Okay. Let's see if I have Dan on my list.
The former president tried to overturn the results of a legitimate election and provoked an assault on our own government. And well over half the Senate Republican conference decided to condone it. The most despicable.
So I'm trying to think who surprised me today. I'm gonna have to look this up. There was a surprise on my list. On my vote count list.
Wasn't about choosing country over party, even not that. This was about choosing country over Donald Trump and 43 Republicans.
So there's two. So the Republicans, the standard Republicans, I thought were going to cross.
It should be a weight on their conscience.
And I can't find
And it shall be a weight
it.
on their conscience in the future.
No.
As sad as that
Yes, I was
is,
surprised.
as condemnable as the decision was, it is still true that the final vote on Donald Trump's conviction was the largest and most bipartisan vote of any presidential impeachment trial in American history. I salute
So Bukowski was a surprise.
who did the right thing. It wasn't easy. We know that. Let their
That was a no. Rob Portman's not voting was a surprise.
If this nation
Mitt Romney's vote was not a surprise.
we as a people cannot sanction the former president's Congress. Because if lying about
Still was no surprise to say the world.
if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political
Alright,
violence
so who
becomes
was
the
it?
norm,
Gosh, I feel stupid
it will
over
be
this.
open season on our democracy. And everything will be up for grabs by whoever has
Who
the
was it
biggest
again?
claws, the sharpest spears, the most powerful guns.
Hey, well,
Not
thanks.
recognizing the heinous crime that Donald Trump committed against the Constitution, Republican senators have not only risked,
Alright,
potentially invited, the same danger.
so I'm gonna have. There are two Republicans I can't count for right now, and I'm kind of feeling dumb here because I can't count for them in this.
On Donald Trump's conviction.
So I'm gonna pause this for just a second. I try to gather that information.